Welcome back to Big Sky Buckets. I'm Big Sky, and I'm sorry that I've been gone for a little bit. Took a little bit of a break, had some other things going on in my life. But we're going to start this back up. I don't want to just give up on this, obviously. I enjoy doing this. Um, and basically, the next chapter is this upcoming season. Now, still about a month and some change away, but going to start doing some power rankings here. Preliminary power rankings from how I view teams' off seasons and everything in between. And I'm basically going to do tiers based on where I think they'll go in the regular season, building up to kind of just like a theoretical playoff predictions along with awards, etc. So, starting off, we got to talk about the bottom of the barrel tier. And I'm going to do these through tiers because I think this gets really complicated when you really try and be like, hey, this is the best team, this is the second best team. I'm going to do it like numbered as well, but I do think tiers help differentiate where I view these teams going into this season. And the first tier is absolutely the bottom of the barrel. There's three teams. I think they're all going to vie for the number one pick in this year's draft. That's how, the draft lottery works. They'll all have 14% chance to get the number one pick. And those three teams are separate from kind of the other segment of lottery teams that inevitably, will end up being in the lottery, because I think they're just a tier below those teams. These three teams, I feel like, are just kind of the three worst teams in the league going into the year. And to start with, we're going to talk about the team that is unapologetically awful, and that is the Brooklyn Nets. And honestly, congratulations to them. I'm very happy they decided to stop being, mid, by getting rid of Mikal Bridges, getting like 6 picks and swaps, and then sending over the Suns picks that they got in the Kevin Durant trade to Houston to get their own picks back. So they can, they can just be terrible and really be in the running for Cooper Flagg. And, there's something to be said about, if you do believe that the draft is rigged, this one could easily go to the Brooklyn Nets if another team that still has like a top 10, top 15 guy in a big market, if those teams accidentally find their way into the lottery, then, they might have a pretty good shot. Like, if the Warriors are really bad, there's probably a good chance that, if rigging it is for real, and like there's certain drafts where I genuinely believe it's like, okay, they got to be rigging it. Like Wemby to San Antonio is like, he's going to get developed, like all the hype, it's going to come true. Last year, probably not so much, just because it's like no generational talent, but there is one in this year's draft. It's pretty obvious to see out the gate. But if none of those teams end up bottoming out, Brooklyn Nets are probably a pretty good place to start with a guy. Clean slate. There's no franchise level guy on this team. Despite what Nets fans might tell you about Cam Thomas, he is not a franchise cornerstone. This team doesn't have much depth. They don't really have much talent when you look across the board. There's a lot of talented teams in this league, and some of them are just bad because they just can't put it together, or the collective talent here just doesn't play well with each other, which we'll get to in the next tier. There's a couple of those teams. But this one, there's not a number one option. There's not a number two option. I don't even know if there's a number three option. You're looking most likely as the starting crew being Dennis Schroeder, who is fantastic at FIBA, but he kind of has, not been super great in the NBA over the past couple of years. Cam Thomas probably is going to be a starting shooting guard, and he's going to light it up. It may not be efficient, and it may not lead to wins, because that's how I view Cam Thomas, honestly. I think he's entertaining to watch, but it does not equate to winning basketball. You do have Cam Johnson, who's great, but he's not going to, carry this team. You have Dorian Finney-Smith, who's also a very good role player. Again, not going to carry anything. And then you have Nick Claxton, who has had up and down moments in this league, and he's best paired with a really good point guard. Problem is, I don't really think Dennis Schroeder fits that mold. I don't know if ever, like, he's always been best in the NBA as more of a six man. So collectively here, just not working with much. You do have Bojan off the bench, and you have a bunch of young guys that I think they're just going to take swings on. Noah Clowney, Dariq Whitehead. There's a bunch of these like younger guys that haven't really gotten an opportunity. Just give them a chance, because what else are you playing for? This was what they did in the offseason was great for them by just saying, let's try and get a cornerstone. Let's try and build around someone, because when you look at this team, they're not really building around anyone. And then say what you want about Jacques Vaughn. I don't really have an opinion on him. I don't think he's great. I don't know if he's terrible yet. I guess we'll find out. Like, if they're really like historically awful this year, yeah, I might say he's got to go. But you know, I'll leave that talk about Jacques Vaughn. If he's still coaching like next year, and we're watching, you know, probably a top 3 draft pick playing for the Brooklyn Nets, then we can have a discussion about him. But the obvious view of this team, when you break down this team like a dossier, you're looking at it like this team should not win many games. They should be doing everything in their power to get Bojan, Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith minutes so that they can inevitably flip them for draft capital young players to teams trying to win a championship. But, you know, I think their over-under was like 19 games or something like that. I need to double check that. I don't expect much of this team, and especially in their division. Now, divisions don't really matter as much in the NBA, but when you look at it from the standpoint of like which teams are they more than likely going to play about 4 times or more, they're just going to get rocked by most of these teams like the Celtics, the Knicks, the 76ers. These teams are going to be juggernauts in the East in general, so they don't have a shot at winning any of those games. And they're almost in a tier of their own, because I think there's at least some argument for the next worst team being like, hey, look at the surrounding talent at least, and at least the young talent on this team. Whereas with the Nets, it's kind of just, it feels like no man's land when you look at the depth of this roster and be like, I just don't really know what I'm looking at, and I don't know how to equate the collective talent here to any kind of wins. But they'll win some games. There's no way they can go 0 of 82. But I do think they are the worst team in the league, and I think they made that known this offseason. Going into the second worst team in the league is the same second worst team in the league from last year. I have the Washington Wizards. Now, part of this is just simply being in the East. You know, the East is worse than the West. I think the top half of the East is getting better. I think the middle part of the East is a bunch of wild card teams. It's really hard to truly evaluate. But with the Wizards here, the one thing I was actually debating for a little bit until I was like, this is stupid. It's absolutely the Nets are going to be the worst team. The Wizards here, what they have going for them is there are certain players here, like Malcolm Brogdon, Kyle Kuzma when he wants to play smart basketball, Jonas Valanciunas. These guys can impact winning, especially like Malcolm Brogdon. But it's pretty obvious they're there to be flipped for assets because, again, the core of this team, or just the foundation of this team, is built from the Bradley Beal trade, which they got no assets for. So they went out and they signed Jonas Valanciunas. They signed Saddiq Bey, so when he comes back either later in the year or next year, eventually they can start to get that trade value up so they can flip them down the line. But the core of this team is Bilal Coulibaly, who they drafted last year in the lottery, Bub Carrington, Alex Sarr, who they drafted this year in the lottery, and I guess Keyshawn George, but otherwise, you know, Jordan Poole is still here, but I don't know how to evaluate him as a player, and I was definitely harsh on him this past year, but this will be my final year of being open-minded to seeing actual development in terms of winning styles of basketball and just not being one of the worst players in the league in terms of contract and what you're doing on the court. But collectively here, there's just a lot going on, because if it is true that Alex Sarr like really lobbied to go to the Wizards so that he could be an offensive option, well, there's a lot of offensive options already because Jordan Poole is going to light it up. Kyle Kuzma is going to take a lot of shots. I mean, if Alex Sarr doesn't want to play center, then you're probably going to start like Jonas Valanciunas. He may not be an offensive option, but that does immediately hinder Bilal Coulibaly, probably relegating him to the bench because Jordan Poole is probably going to be a starting shooting guard unless they just are deciding we're going to bite the bullet on this contract and just like let it run its course. But I doubt that's going to happen. And then, of course, now that you have Malcolm Brogdon, he's probably going to start so that you can get his trade value up. So realistically here, it's kind of the same outlook as the Nets, but there's just a little bit more going for them. Like, in my opinion, you want to run Malcolm Brogdon for the first couple of months of the season to get his trade value up and then have Bob Carrington come off the bench for him and learn under him a little bit so that eventually when you trade Malcolm Brogdon for some assets, you can then slot Bub into the starting position. I think it's time to trade Kyle Kuzma, and I think you just give it a couple months as well, have Bilal relegated to the bench, and then eventually once you move off of Kyle Kuzma, you can put Bilal back to where he should be in the starting lineup. And then same for Jonas Valanciunas, is just someone's eventually going to be like, I need a center, whether it's backup or starting, and he's on a solid contract, so it's displaying that and then doing what you can to develop. Like, Alex Sarr will be great defensively. Offensively, it might just the offense might be so bad and the defense might be so good that it's just like a net neutral when he's out there. But you kind of just have to go through that as a rebuilding team. Like, if you can see flashes, you're good. As long as it's not the summer league offense, and it's just a wee bit better than that, where you're not shooting it 15 times and missing every time, you can be happy with that. Bub's going to be great. You know, Keyshawn George off the bench probably for Alex Sarr. Just enjoy the young guys because at least you have that, and the Nets don't really have that. So there's at least something to watch the Wizards for. But other than that, you know, it's just kind of hard to say that they would be better than any team above them because there's a little bit more talent on each of these teams. But again, you got the second pick in this draft, but this draft didn't have generational talent from, unless, like, we could be wrong, but typically we're not. Typically scouts are not that wrong on it. I mean, they were in 2013. Yeah, 2013 when Giannis went 15th, but to be fair, that was just like an incredible development story because he was a completely different player before he just got super duper strong and super big. But yeah, like, hopefully you can get that from Sarr, but I don't know. He's got to learn to play in the interior a lot more. But should be interesting to watch this team going forward or in this upcoming year. But again, I have a hard time trying to rank them above anyone else. Like, I think they're better than the Nets, and that's really about it. Again, these bottom of the barrel teams, it's really hard to make an argument that they're going to be better than some of these other teams. And I think the Wizards slot in as the 29th best team in the league. And coming in at the final bit of the bottom of the barrel, the 28th best team in the league. It's like in The Dark Knight Rises when Bane tells one of his henchmen they expect one of us in the Wreckage Brother. Like, some team from the West has to be in this bottom three worst teams. It's rarely ever one conference pumps out the three worst teams in the league. And so I have the Portland Trailblazers. Now, they do have talent on this team. My biggest issue is that I do think people will expect a Spurs jump a little bit. I don't think it's going to be as big as like 30 plus wins, but it could be closer to 30. I think the Jazz have found themselves in a position where they're basically going to get about 30 wins or so every year. So it's hard to say they'll be the worst team in the West. And then, you know, sure, I'm not going to project the Warriors to fall off completely. And I'm not going to project the Lakers to fall off completely or the Clippers to fall off completely. I think those are some of, you know, the picks you might have for a team just completely just falling off. therefore, I think it just leaves the Trailblazers here. I do think everyone else in the West is pretty competent in some area, and that, unless injuries just derail a team like the Grizzlies last year, I think that just leaves the Trailblazers here. Now, what I'm predicting for the starting lineup for the Portland Trailblazers here, you get Scoot for the full 82 games this year, unlike last year. Anthony Simons, the Dame disciple himself, as the kind of undersized shooting guard. I don't love the backcourt defense of this team, but whatever. Should be at least fun to watch. Denny Abdia, he got in the trade on draft night. I think he could be the small forward of the future for this team, especially with the contract is incredible, and he's really starting to show that, like, he's progressing to be a good to great NBA player. Like, he's definitely a most improved candidate, unless, the NBA is just like, we're just going to give it to Victor Wembanyama, which is a whole different discussion. We'll get there later. You have Jeremy Grant still there, and then you have this really intriguing logjam of centers. All have some level of talent and all have some deficiency. Now, I would love to see Donovan Clingan start, but that just wouldn't make sense. Because you gotta trade DeAndre Ayton at this point, because you took Clingan, and I do think he's your center of the future. Ayton's making too much money. You gotta get some assets back for him. So you're gonna have to play him. Now, of course, that means probably six man is up for debate here, but look, the bench is going to be like Toumani Camara, Shaedon Sharpe, Donovan Clingan, and a couple of others here. So there's a lot of talent here. And again, when you look at this roster, it doesn't scream bottom three in the league. But typically, someone in the West has to get, the brakes beaten off of them. And this is the team that I think. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, I do like Scoot Henderson. I do think he'll be good in this league. But because he didn't start all 82 games, and, it's really hard for a point guard to come in and, do the whole 82 game grind as the starter and being given the keys to the organization, the franchise. I think he's going to go through a lot of struggles this year as well. I do think he'll take some leaps and bounds, but to be honest, the point guard position, I run with the rule of the 3-year guard plan. A point guard after the third year, or during the third year, if they don't show you that they're, closer to, like, good to great, then that's kind of just who they are. Like, it's that third year when point guards really figure it out. So that's kind of like the strike on this team, is that the point guard play, because they did have Malcolm Brogdon for a good chunk of last year, because he did get injured at some point. He did help, this team in terms of playmaking and understanding how to be a point guard. And I think Scoot's going to have to go through a lot of those trials and tribulations this go round. I think the backcourt defense is not great. I think there's questions about DeAndre Ayton. I think he'll put up stats, but will that equate to winning? And then again, you're looking at DeAndre Ayton, probably Robert Williams III, who's also on this team. He's part of the center logjam. I know they're trying to trade him now. You're just trying to get rid of some of these guys to open more slots for some of these younger guys. Like, it's crazy to think that Shaedon Sharpe will be relegated to the bench, kind of like Bilal Coulibaly with the Wizards here, but there's just a little too much talent, and there's just kind of the politics of the NBA being like, we're rebuilding teams, we want more assets, we kind of have to play the guys that have, like, big contracts so that we can flip them for either other young guys or draft capital to continue this rebuild. And so that's where Shaedon Sharpe kind of gets screwed over here. Donovan Clingan, of course. So with that being said, like, putting a lot of faith in Scoot to have just figured this out immediately is a lot after all these struggles he had last year and not even starting all 82 games. So I think he's going to go through a lot of struggles, and I do think that will actually be the detriment to this team, opposed to some of the other teams in the West that could technically be closer to this tier than not. And so, the outlook is the same as the other three. It's the same outlook, really, with a caveat with this team. if Scoot does figure it out way faster than anticipated in terms of really, you know, the playmaking, the understanding of the pace of play, and how to get everyone involved at certain times, sharing the rock, etc., and of course his 3-point shooting, this team could be not the worst team in the West, and therefore they might just be looking to develop their younger guys, um, like Klingon, like Scoot, like Shaden Sharp, etc. I just don't necessarily see that happening just because there's at least a history with some of these other teams or the players that they have acquired since then to make more of a jump than I think this team will. I also, don't love their head coach. So that's honestly kind of the ding here. Is like at least with the Jazz and the Spurs like their head coach, and at least with the Jazz and Spurs, there's a guy on there that you could say is definitely a number 1 or number 2 option on its like absolutely on a team that can get them wins. Lauri Markkanen for the Jazz can get them wins. I think everyone here knows Victor Wembanyama is most likely going to take a jump with the real point guard, and that is going to equate to wins. It's hard to kind of see that happening for the Trailblazers. Now, you could be placing a lot more faith in Scoot and Anthony Simons and like their starting 5 and say, hey, like this could be a real squad here. But again, like I said at the beginning, someone has to be 15th in the West. And this is just where I have them. Unless something drastic happens to some different team that people have a lot more expectations for in terms of making the playoffs, play in, or even being a contender, I can't see a realm where it's not the Portland Trailblazers. And that is the bottom of the barrel tier. Look, the next tier, gonna come up with a name for it, but really it's not the worst, but far from the best. Probably is gonna be the next tier where they're not wild cards, but they should almost round out the lottery teams, because when we get to the play-in tier, that's when you get to all these like X factors, like real wild card teams, because where you could project them is probably some of the has the biggest variance, honestly. So thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Subscribe, like, comment. I'd really appreciate all the support. We're going to get this thing on track again, guys. I swear this time. And thank you guys again. I appreciate any lenience from the little break I had. And like I said, we're going to get the ball rolling. Peace.